We did want to take a minute and shout out our sponsors again. And if you're interested in sponsoring, whether you're here today or whether you're watching us online, please reach out. We would love all kinds of collaborations and supporters. And obviously, as we cross-pollinate these ideas, these strategies, these resources, we can help each other. There's just wins all the way around in this, in this segment. So I get really excited about that. And definitely follow us on social if you're not already. If you're on LinkedIn, definitely connect. Let's connect with each other there. And I know we've had the Carbon Summit listed there, so events in the future, I'm sure will be there. And then YouTube.
Yeah, YouTube. We really started that at the end of January.
Oh, wow.
And we're I think 1,100 subscribers right now. And the video that we started with was Gabe Brown, around regenerative ag, and that's 100,000 views.
When did you post that video?
End of January.
Okay, all right. So if you were here this morning, we played a video, and that has over 100,000 views already. So
yeah. So like social-wise, that's a way that we can kind of connect, that we can network. And if people have quote unquote sustainable solutions, or you have things that you want to talk about, that's what our platform is for. Is really to connect, to promote, to help you scale, to connect those dots. And I think that's where our bread and butter, I guess, is at.
I think we're ready to bring on our next speaker. Let me tell you a little bit about Bryan Lawley. He's the president of EGT Solar. He's considered a leader in Idaho and beyond in renewable energy solutions.
Yeah, and Bryan, I had the chance to talk to him, it was like a month and a half ago. And the guy, EGT is the oldest solar company in Idaho. I think when, he started, there was 50 installs in the States, and he can tell you about kind of what they're doing. I think they even got some cool stuff, ready to talk about here, potentially. But when I went and talked to Bryan, he's like, hey, we need to talk about these things. I agree with what you're saying. And so, Bryan came on, and we want to talk more about what they're doing, promote them, see where we can find our fit, I guess, to really expand this message. Because when we're talking energy systems, we're going to need everybody,
Right.
from all the sectors, because we're a fossil fuel, auto-centric, base-built foundational economy. And so we're talking about a massive transition here, humongous. And so it's going to take all hands on deck. Like Finney was saying, the ag sector, it's just not the ag sector. I think everything is coming under a transformative, adaptive, type of approach or perspective. And so, I'm excited to have Bryan come up, and without further ado.
Yeah, Bryan Lawley, welcome to the stage.
Hello, everybody. First, I'd like to thank Jason and Shelley, of course, and their team for inviting me to speak here, along with everybody else on the discussion and the speakers and the panels. There's obviously some really educated and smart people here. So yeah, really appreciate what these guys have done to throw this together, and I think it's a really good thing. When Jason approached me, like he said, about a month and a half ago, I was kind of thrown to this late to the game, we'll call it. So I really just kind of wanted to talk about renewable energy in general, solar here in Idaho. It's a really interesting kind of evolution that this market's gone through since, we'll call it 2010. We started late 2009 and incorporated in late 2010. And in that time frame, it's been pretty wild. It's been a pretty wild ride in general. So just kind of want to fill you guys in on the status where we're at with the market here in Idaho. Because it's pretty exciting and pretty encouraging to see the adoption rates just keep going up and up and up like they do nationally. But it's nice to see Idaho following that trend, as we typically are a little bit behind the eight ball with things day in, day out. So yeah, so as Jason mentioned, in 2010, there were 54 total solar installations in the state of Idaho, which is pretty tough to imagine that there's that few. So when I started this company, people were telling me I was crazy. It's not ever going to work here. You heard all those negative things. My stance on it growing up in Twin Falls, Idaho, and farm country was, the sun quality we have here, it's not an if market, it's a when market. And if I can hold on until the when gets here, we'd be okay. And fortunately, that's kind of how it worked out, and it's just continued to grow and grow and grow from there. So we're up over 9,000 installs today. I think 8,700 of those are currently online and installed with Idaho Power, which is a pretty substantial growth rate since 2010. There's 28 registered install companies. I think 2 or 3 a day are popping onto that list. It seems like we have no really barriers of entry into our market here, so we get a lot of crossover from Utah and from other regional states that want to come and play in here because we have some of the best solar net metering in the country at an equal one-for-one exchange with Idaho Power, which hasn't come without its battles on the policy side to keep that favorable for consumers and business owners alike. So installs this year are up roughly 31% just here in Idaho. 2020 nationally, solar was up 42% from 2019. So we've been kind of continually seeing these 30, 40, 50% jumps nationally in solar. Obviously, costs are coming down substantially, which drives demand. Tax credits being renewed, that's all part of it, and we'll get to some more of that here in a minute. So really just kind of want to give a state of the state address on where we're at with our solar market here in Idaho and talk a little bit more about that. This slide, I'm not sure what happened, disappeared, but we'll move on to the next one. So what's driving all this growth here in Idaho? Solar Sun Radiance, right? 282 sunny days per year, ranked 9th in the country. The Snake River Plains, which you'll see on a forward slide here, have equal solar potential or very close to Texas. And so when you think about that dynamic, most people don't realize that those long summer days and traditionally mild winters we have here lend to some really, really high production values relative to some other states, especially here in the Pacific Northwest. Lower summer ambient temperatures. Anything with electronics, heat's always going to be your killer. So where we operate at, much lower ambient temperatures in the summer than Arizona and Texas and these other hot solar markets, Southern California, panels are able to get to peak quicker, stay there longer. Thus, annually are going to produce, very close to the same amount. So other stuff, tax credits, obviously with the new administration coming in, that was renewed through the end of next year at 26%. I've heard a lot of rumbling already of a 7-year extension on top of that, which in the past, that's always been a 5-year type program where they'll renew that for 5 years. But I know there's legislation out there already introduced for another 7-year push on that. If that happens, who knows? That's kind of the industry we live in. So I think consumers are getting much more educated and smarter as to trying to retire with more money, and with inflation going crazy with a lot of facets of the construction industries and everything we see going on right now in the country. I think people realize that, leveling out what is the highest reoccurring bill within your home, you're not going to have that bill at some point, even if you finance the system from the start. It's going to go away at some point versus the utility, which is really a rental situation where we're just succumb to rate increases, and population growth is going to certainly push that higher and higher as we move on here year over year. So I think people have seen a lot of solar going up around the valley, more so every year that moves on. People are becoming more aware of it. Social media is a big part of that, good, bad, or indifferent. There's some mixed messaging out there with social media. But it's building awareness, and I think people are more curious as to, they see a neighbor doing it. Well, let me understand your thought process of why you guys are doing that. It's not always financially driven. A lot of it's environmentally, which, you get those warm and fuzzies about, doing the right thing and using it as an educational piece for your children or universities. So it's cool to watch. Electric vehicles, obviously, those are coming down the pipe very fast. I think quicker than most people probably even realize at this point. And with that comes, advanced battery technology, which is, implemented within our industry day in, day out. And I think that's just going to continue to grow. I heard a stat the other day, it's over $1 trillion market over the next 10 years is just the residential battery storage marketplace, which if you think about big players like Panasonic, Samsung, Tesla, everybody out there in this game, LG Chem's a big one. These guys are all running and gunning for a massive chunk of the market, which, it helps with distribution, utilities, frees up peak demand power so we can bring more industry jobs in here, and we'll get to some of that here in a minute as well. So those are some of the main contributing factors that are driving the growth here locally. Technically, we're one of the fastest per capita solar markets in the country right now over the last 18 months, which is really exciting to see. And I don't see that slowing down. So, excited about that. Let's see here what we got. So, local economies. I think jobs is always something that's on the table of conversation and topic. You know, we have way more jobs within the solar industry, you know, not just here in Idaho, but across the country than we do in fossil fuels. Those jobs are not, you know, 10, 13 bucks an hour type jobs. You're talking about electrical engineers, you're talking about design professionals, journeyman and master electricians, you know, all sorts of people that are involved with this snowball effect and how this is driving money back into the local economies. You know, you know, a lot of our money we spend on oil and gas and fossil fuels leaves the state. We've known that for a very long time. Renewable energy locally gives you the opportunity to keep that money in the local economies and recirculate that back around, which, you know, in times like this, there's a lot of people struggling, you know, semi-post-COVID, we'll call it. So yeah, we push local message really hard. You know, we've been in business coming up on 12 years now in November, and you know, we've pushed that local message very, very hard, because the reality is we're fighting these net metering battles and rate cases, and we're pushing money back to local charities and nonprofits. And I think, you know, buying local in any business arena is just simply a good practice to have. And I think Idahoans are very critical of paying attention to that, which is really refreshing. So, as I mentioned earlier, substantial market growth leads to a lot more job opportunities. I mean, you know, I employ 14 full-time people, have, you know, another 7 or 8 independent contractors. You know, at the rate that we're growing, and I'm sure a lot of other solar providers in the state are not any different, is, you know, we plan on doubling that next year, right? And, you know, like I said, these are not, you know, run-of-the-mill $12 an hour type jobs. You know, they're all doing very well for themselves with full benefits, and so we try our best to make sure that this is not just a job, but it's a career for these people. Put them through apprentice school to become journeyman electrician, NABCEP certification if they want to go that route for either sales or technical professionals within the solar industry. So, you know, really, really high quality jobs, I would say, relative to some other stuff out there in the construction trades and in the contracting industries that they would otherwise have the option to go look at and do. So, you know, we have a lot of high gross power users in the state of Idaho. Micron obviously comes first to mind. St. Luke's is a big one. You know, we're having these conversations right now about the dams potentially coming down and, you know, protecting the salmon population. Well, if that were to happen, that limits hydroelectricity opportunities. My grandfather, actually one of the largest, longest seasoned hydro developers, Auger Falls, out of Twin Falls area. He's sold power now at Idaho Power for 63 years, which is pretty incredible. So if the dams come down, that obviously creates a need to supplement in other areas, and I think solar is going to be a big part of that to help meet state energy goals. Idaho Power obviously is advertising, you know, fully renewable by 2045. We have a long way to go to do that, because technically right now in Idaho, solar is less than 2% of the rate-paying population is using solar on a rooftop. So we're a sliver of that energy portfolio, and thus a massive opportunity to grow and expand in that area. Which goes a long ways, right? If we can reduce capacity on distributed generation, right, is if we have these rooftops that are power plants, right, how much demand energy does that free up to bring another Paylocity in here, another Amazon, you know, distribution center? You know, those types of large draw power users have to have demand power here, and typically the utility in any state is the last check mark box on that list before they're allowed to come into the state and operate and hire a bunch of local people. So I think this is all kind of synonymous with, you know, going down this path and figuring out a way to protect jobs here in the state and build more jobs and more high-paying jobs from the tech industry that's obviously attracted to this valley. So it's pretty exciting stuff. So I mentioned earlier about the Snake River Plains just having great solar, you know, Sun Radiance. Solar is unique in the fact that it's only a renewable source that mirrors peak demand. This kind of goes back to my statement a minute ago. It's producing at its highest value when the utility needs it the most, plain and simple. Thus, it's never going to go away, in my opinion, and there's not much risk to that. If the sun comes up, you're producing power. That's really what your risk level is in any solar, whether it's commercial, agricultural, residential. So that is a huge thing that the utilities are also starting to recognize outside of state of Idaho. that and power quality, right? You'll see a lot of these small solar farms now being installed to substations because solar produces a much cleaner form of energy, about the cleanest you can get. And so it acts like a large capacitor next to these substations that as that power is leaving and being transmitted down the line, solar is actually helping that be more efficient in its route down to the consumer. So there's some good value points there that not a lot of people may realize. So then of course, environmental pollution. Every watt we produce with solar is less greenhouse gas we're putting out there in the market. Cost dropping, that's a big, I looked at a stat the other day. I think, just since 2015, we've dropped 42% in costs. That's pretty substantial in, 6 years, if you will. So I think we're pretty levelized in that area. I don't see substantial cost drops from this point, just because the manufacturing process is pretty intensive to create these solar panels and other components within our industry that we use in the day-to-day. So where I do see a lot of cost shifting is the battery market. We've seen about a $2,000 per year cost drop in batteries, which is pretty substantial. But again, you go back to the electronics players that are in that industry, it's the same exact people that are doing flat screen TVs, right? We all have seen what has happened with that evolution of $6,000 to $600 for the same TV in 5 years, right? So I don't see it being that extreme with the battery technology, but being as big a market as it's going to be, I see some significant cost reduction there. And that's kind of what we coach our clients on is, get yourself battery ready, if you will, get the right components to do it. But the longer you wait on the battery, the cheaper and the better the technology is going to continue to get. So I think there's a lot of advancement in that side of our industry that we're pretty close to watching. So another big topic in our industry relative to carbon is what is it? You'll hear. I've heard a bunch of questioning and negative things about solar panels and ending up in landfills. I think one of the biggest niche markets that's popped up in our industry over the last, I'd say 3 years now, is we get about 2 calls a month from solar panel recycling companies that are saying, hey, do you guys have any panels we can buy off of you? So they figured out a lot of avenues to repurpose the components and materials within these solar panels at the end of life, where if one's broken and it can't be put on a roof anywhere, there is a source now to keep a lot more of these out of the landfills. To say they're all not going there, that'd be lying. But I think as our industry continues to mature across the country, that these factors are really starting to be addressed. And looking at, and I've heard many times too from the other side of the aisle is, solar panels aren't worth what it costs to produce them relative to carbon. And so Jason and I talked about this a lot in my office when he came in and chatted with me for what felt like 5 hours, Jason, but I think it was an hour and a half or something, but we just got into a good conversation. And so this stat I think is pretty powerful. It's solar panel around 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt during the first 3 initial years is what that stat was. It's 20 times less carbon output of coal-powered electricity sources, and that's even accounting for the manufacturing process. So I think there's some skewed perception there on the dirtiness, we'll call it, of producing a solar panel. So I look at the auto industry. I think cars are in car graveyards and landfills, and we see that all over, even Idaho in remote areas. You'll drive and see a lot of 200 old cars sitting in the middle of a farm field, right? So I think that's always something to look at, is we have to look at all sides of our industry and figure out ways that we can be cleaner and really practice what we preach to the consumers, right? And if we're not doing that, then we're not really doing justice to kind of providing a true and transparent experience to every consumer. But consumers are smart. They're asking all the right questions, and I think education has been the key to the growth in Idaho overall. Just because of, it's a new market. When we first started, it seemed like, there's a ton of skepticism, and you get that phone call from the wife or the husband, a month after you put the system in, oh my gosh, this thing really worked. And, you're going, well, of course it works. It's tried and true. It's been around for 42 years at this point, right? Like, of course the technology works, but that's just how new the market was early on in the age. And so to see the progression of this market and where it's at now to, I think it's an early adoption stage still, but I think we're kind of on a mountaintop or down here, and we got nowhere to go but up the mountain, and that's pretty exciting to see that for not just us, but Idaho in general. I think to take advantage of that free resource is pretty powerful. So
I've got a landowner in Texas that wants to put in 600 acres.
Okay.
And he's copying a deal called Sundrop Farms in Australia. Are you familiar with that project?
I've heard of it.
Yeah, they took that energy, turned it into producing power to heat a boiler, put in a boiler to heat seawater, and they're growing tomatoes. Will we ever see anything like that in this capacity in the United States, or is that kind of beyond our realm?
I think you will. I don't know that you'll see that anytime soon in Idaho, right? I think the big stuff like that, where you're crossing over into other technologies, the mix and matching, which is really cool, right? A lot of people are harvesting underground mount all sorts of crops, right? We've seen that for years happen in overseas and other markets. I do think you'll see that here in the U.S. I think Idaho will be one of the, just because our base cost of power is so low relative to the rest of the states, I don't think the economics of that will work out for investors to come in here on a large scale and do that here, but Texas, absolutely.
First time I met Jason, we went out and looked at a solar array in Grandview
Oh, okay.
that runs two 40-horsepower pumps, and the Boise Electric Co-op does a trade-off. So basically all that irrigation is free for the farmer that did it. And one of the biggest consumers of all electricity is pumps, agriculture pumps specifically. So this is sort of a multi-pronged question.
Sure.
Just setting up solar arrays to do pumps and then having it feed back into the grid, is that realistic in the future?
Well, I don't know how close you followed the recent rate case that we went through. It was specific to agricultural and large industrial. It was specific to agricultural because Idaho had one of the largest per capita growth markets in the agricultural sector for net metering applications back in 2019. And I think Idaho Power stood there and kind of went, whoa, this is coming down the pipe very fast. And so I was pretty involved with that rate case, or was close to it. I wasn't very involved, but I was close to it and followed it very closely. There has been a change in the agricultural sector. So 2 years ago, I would have had a different answer to this question. It would have made all the sense in the world. So now where residential sectors here get an equal one-for-one exchange on a kilowatt hour and are now subject to future rate changes, right, which batteries can help mitigate, farmers are now paid a wholesale rate for the excess generation. So if you're running a pivot for 5 months out of the year on that pump, you're generating the other 7 months the pump's not turned on in trying to build those credits up. So when you flip that switch, when you start watering, that pump starts driving, that you've got enough credits built up to get that pretty darn close to 100% offset on the KWH side per year. So it is viable. We've looked at a lot of farm applications where we're doing dual axis trackers in the corner of the fields where the pivots are turning, because in farming it comes down to profit per acre, right? And if that makes sense, then a lot of farmers are going to do it, and that's what was happening. And so now to go to a wholesale rate, if you're paying 5 cents, 5.2 cents per kilowatt hour on a pivot motor, the big thing that I've heard growing up in farm country is that farmers don't like paying demand rates, right? The relationship with solar and agricultural prior to this rate case that just changed here in January of this year was that we could affect KWH with solar, but we could not affect the demand rates, right? So we could get somebody to 100% offset, but you're still paying this huge demand fee every month when you're really only using your pump for 5 months out of the year, or 4 months, right? So that was pretty frustrating to, feedback from the farmers was that was frustrating. We'd rather have a higher KWH rate and use our pumps and pay for the power when we're using it, but not pay that demand rate the other 7 months when the pump's turned off and we're not even operating it. But if you look at the economics behind that, if the KWH rates go up, solar becomes more attractive, thus the growth rate goes substantially up, and I don't feel like that was the intent. So now the relationship has changed to large industrial and agricultural, where we go in and we don't go into a transformer, and I'll speak on College of Idaho because we have a system that we've proposed here to lease back to the university because they're a nonprofit, obviously. So we would land in the switchgear here at College of Idaho as an example, so it's directly consumed. The excess then is measured through reprogramming the existing meter setup that they have here on campus, and then they're given a wholesale value versus the retail that they're paying that the Idaho Power in this case, or any utility. And this is a common thing across the country with utilities and our industry is what is the true value of an excess generated kWh credit to a utility, and what's it worth to a consumer, and we're in the middle of it, right? So yes, it is viable, I would say. It's still, if you look at peer financial rates of return, if power is going to go up, that's really the key to any solar investment. If the power rates continue to climb with the population and us having to add infrastructure to serve that population, solar at any level is going to make sense. And you get into some larger scale stuff in the farm world where the price per watt is very economical.
So that was the kudos question. I think that's a great path. The issue that we have experienced in my home county is we also have a similar environment to here.
Okay.
Probably not as much water, so really appealing to solar companies to come in and put these solar panels in. The last round of permitting, our commissioner has finally had to put their foot down and say, you're not building any more solar panels on ag land, because just like solar panels seem to do best on the same places that we grow our food. So that is one issue. And then the next issue of putting these solar panels in rural communities. Once a lot of the solar plants are built, especially the companies that are building where I'm at, those companies sell and move on. They have bonds, but it seems to deteriorate over time. Eventually, these solar panels, these solar farms are going to become dysfunctional unless they're traded out. As far as I can see, it's leaving a lot of rural communities holding the bags on these huge infrastructures of solar things that are going to age out in 20 or 30 years. And I think that ultimately the cleanup or the retrofitting of those solar panels is going to cost the communities more money than it ever put into those communities.
Yeah, that's not we don't do a lot of the large scale type stuff, and I can see how that's definitely a valid concern, right? I mean, most of the large stuff's done through PPAs or power purchase agreements where you have a third party holding that contract that's responsible for operation and maintenance, and usually at the end of that contract, what happens with that system is it goes back to the original owner for, let's just say at the end of the 25-year term on a PPA. Solar panels are going to go 40 plus years. They're just degrading much quicker from year 25 to year 40, right? So at year 40, that's a great point, is what happens to that? Are you retrofitting it back on the same stands or racks, or bringing all new stuff in, and who takes it out? So that's, where we're at in our industry in Idaho, we'll call it a 10-year-old industry. That's good for foresight to look down the line and maybe broach that subject, because that's not something we've dealt with personally. But I can understand definitely how that's a concern for small communities.
So I got a question. So we're based out of Trailhead in downtown Boise.
Yep.
And we had a guy come in, and he was talking about creating a solar agency. And he started in Salt Lake, and so he's kind of got the MLM mentality of selling solar. But what is the challenge, or what is the problem with all of these? I don't want to say fly by night, because that might not be the best term, I guess you could say. But these up and coming solar agencies that are basically looking to sell you, but they don't necessarily maintain the relationship. Maybe kind of what. To go off of what Rich was talking about, you have these companies that may be bonded or whatever, but they end up leaving the community, and then how does that impact your industry from your standpoint?
Well, so early last year, we lost our biggest competitor in the market, but went bankrupt, unfortunately. They were based out of Utah, but they had 6 branches nationwide, and they were a big player, right? So they were in the market for 4.5 years. Let's just say that they did 400 to 500 installs for local consumers here in the valley. We ended up picking up the service for most of that, right? And the consumers are angry, right, when they call in, because they don't have that workmanship warranty or service contract that they had bought originally, because they're insolvent, right? So there is some distaste when that happens, but I think in the solar industry, I think it's one of the biggest copycat markets in the country, right? It's come about so fast. Everybody just looks at these big guys like Solar City before Tesla bought them out, and it's now Sun Run, Vivint, all these big players, their model is completely different. It is EPC, they'll hire any sales guy. They're a sales company, not a fulfillment company. And I think we've tried our hardest to stay as far away from that as possible because you have no quality control when you do that. And that's one of our huge pushes to a consumer that's looking at a couple different companies is no one touches this but W2 employees of EGT, and that's the reason for that is because to me it's not just about growing as fast as you can and putting up a number every single year. If you're not doing it efficiently, you're not really profitable anyways. So that's going to run its course, and you're going to go out of business if you're doing it that way. So I think it's people that have had to grind through these micro markets like Idaho, right, is where I see the biggest value in small to medium-sized solar companies across the country. I don't pay attention much to the big guys because the financing, in my opinion, is way out of line for what a consumer, if they're not properly educated, should be signing on the dotted line for. And that's just lack of education or provided education by that solar provider if that's their model, just to go as quick as they can, sign here, sign here, sign here. So I think, being top down and fully integrated in any business is how you control your quality and keep your messaging consistent and train your reps the same. So the message that a consumer is getting is not high pressure, it's just education. And if it makes sense for you, great. If not, you don't burn the bridge because, we do 40 to 50 installs a year from people that told us no the previous year. They start thinking about it or something changes financially and they come back and say, hey, let's take a look at this again. And a lot of times they'll go forward. So I'd say it's just Jason, more of a business model choice. But if you're a new startup solar company, you're going to look at the big guys traditionally and say, okay, I see all these huge millions of revenue numbers. I see they're publicly traded. The reality of getting a company to that level, it's very difficult, right? And so unless you scale through a model where you're not really concerned about that customer experience, and you're just going for numbers, then I think that's what happens a lot within our industry is people just look at what the big guys are doing and try and emulate that, and it ends up biting them.
So there's a question that was online is, where do you see solar in Idaho in 10 years?
Oh man, I think we've got some policy challenges to get through. I think, residential, I don't see slowing down. I see it continuing to be one of the fastest growing markets in the country, and with population, obviously that lends to our favor of more opportunity, right? So solar in 10 years, let's say we're at 2% now, as I mentioned earlier. My guess in 10 years is that we should be or could be at around 15% of our total energy portfolio for the state. And that a lot of that plays on what happens with the dams, that conversation. If that happens, I think that drives growth much higher with a need to supplement at a much higher level with solar and other technologies that a lot of the guys have talked about, geothermal being one of those. I see some huge opportunities for that as well.
Anybody else have any questions? Yeah, easy peasy.
All right, appreciate the opportunity, guys.
Let's give a round of applause for Bryan. Thank you.